years. So the kind of change you're talking about, I mean, zebras are far different than horses and people, much more different than people realize. It's not just a striped horse. So, Bill.
Miniaturization.
Yeah.
I've heard that.
Okay. So, Ray, Ray, you have a question?
It's always bothered me about the food supply for such a long period of time.
Right.
So many animals, people.
Right.
Maybe those wives and daughters live for books.
Yeah, I mean, and with hundreds to maybe 1,000 pairs of animals, that is enough to deal with the food. You can have enough food for those animals, and also deal, unfortunately, with the excrement problem. Or someone actually wrote a book called "The Excrement Problem of the Ark," and what a problem that would be. So.
For me, one of the answers, one of the solutions to these connected problems, because they're all connected. But you mentioned divine intervention. Well, there is a thing that we find in nature called hibernation, or near hibernation. Okay, and all God would have to do is to put each one of these animals into a hibernation type of state. They wouldn't need food.
They would still have excrement. They still would.
Well, the thing is, the excrement would be greatly reduced because they're not doing the intake. Okay, so to me, a God-induced form of hibernation of the animals and the creatures around the world would solve many of these problems.
It would solve some of them. You're still probably not dealing with tens of thousands of pairs. You're probably, again, you still have the problem of how do you explain the large number of species today. And again, you would still need some sort of hyper-evolution to get the species we see today, if you take the view that all the species were on the ark. Now, if you make that claim too, then you need water tanks for all the sea creatures as well. So there becomes even a bigger problem there.
Something I was just a little bit curious about something you said.
I was curious about it too.
Did the ark have wolves, or did it have dobermans, pugs, German shepherds?
Well, yeah, what kind of animals? Notice it gives two kinds of animals, clean animals. It gives clean animals and unclean animals. And the clean animals were the ones that were important for the agriculture and for the rapid repopulation of the area. There were 7 pairs of those animals. For the unclean animals, there was 1 pair. So I think we're just talking about the animals that were indigenous to that region. And notice the extent, and this is a good question, I should have brought this up earlier, but notice in the Bible that when God dealing with sin, in some cases, I mean, all sin defiles to some extent. But this, sometimes a sin just defiles the person involved. In other times, it not only affects that person, but their offspring. In other cases, it's the person, the offspring, and their animals. In some cases, the person, their offspring, their animals, and their possessions. And in other cases, most extreme, is it affects the person, their offspring, their animals, their possession, and their agricultural land. And that's the most extreme case you see, is where it's so defiling, it says that land is never going to be used again. And that's why I believe if the population of the earth at this point was in a limited area, the only things that need to be affected by the flood are the things that man's sin had defiled. And all the evidence shows that everything was still in that region, roughly in Mesopotamia at that time. So there's no reason to have to kill the penguins or the polar bears. They hadn't been affected by man's sin. Only those animals indigenous to the region. So as far as where you get a lot of the dog breeds probably done through. I don't think you're going to get a Labrador and a poodle and all those things anyway, because I don't think they were indigenous to the region. But that's why I think you probably can get away with hundreds of pairs rather than thousands, because you're only dealing with animals that were from that region. So God has 2 purposes: to repopulate the wildlife, and again for agricultural and repopulation.
Just a technicality, but in the quotes that you used for sending out the birds, you started with a raven and ended with a dove. Was there symbolism there, or was there a change in species?
Oh no, I think there were different creatures he sent out. Yeah, because I think he says he sent out the raven and it did not return to him, right?
Right.
right? And then he sends out the dove, and the dove does return. Okay, so yeah, I think we're dealing with different species. And I want to touch, oh, sorry, you have a question right there? And I do want to touch on one more point.
I was curious about the effects of Mount St. Helens, the erosive effects of pyroclastic flows in
Yep.
the water and everything else, comparing that with, say, the time span in the Grand Canyon.
Are you talking about in relation to how we can trust the dates, or? Yeah. Well, obviously, we're seeing in the case of Mount St. Helens, we have good, obvious evidence. One of the criticisms you very often hear is in carbon dating, and one of the things when dating is, if you want to be accurate, you have to get something that's within a factor of 6 of the half-life of the thing you're dating. So, if you have carbon, I think carbon 14 has a half-life of roughly 6,000 years. So it's very accurate with things between 1,000 years, which is 1/6, or 36,000 years, which is 6 times the thing you're dating. And very often where you get poor dates is, for example, someone will give someone a sample of something from Mount St. Helens, they use carbon dating on this, and they'll come up with a date of 6,000 years, plus or minus 6,000 years. So look for the error bars. When you get the error bar, very rarely do you ever see anything fall outside of the error bars. I mean, I can tell you, like for the age of the universe, when I first started looking into this 15 years ago, it was 15 billion years, plus or minus 2 billion years. And we're still within those error bars. Then the error bars got smaller and smaller. Then it got to about 14 billion. Then 13.7 billion, now 13.73 billion. And more significant figures tells you that they're really pretty sure. It means they have multiple methods of measuring. For example, the age of the Earth, 4.5662 billion is the last number I heard, something in that range. 5 significant figures. Why? Because they have multiple materials that date. Fortunately, the age of the Earth is easy to date, believe it or not, because we have many elements with half-lives that hit right around the age of the Earth. What's really difficult to age are some of these hominid species that existed 1 million years ago. We don't have any good elements with half-lives of 1 million years. So those, they have to use other methods to try to date, and there you get huge error bars. You don't see numbers like 1.372 million years ago this species existed. You don't get it. So you're kind of within the limits of the laws of physics of what elements you have to test. And again, I'm not a scientist. I'm going to defer that to the experts, who say this is accurate. And there are plenty of Christians in the field who testify these methods are very accurate. And I said, when you see the significant figures, that usually tells you that they're pretty sure that those dates are correct, pretty well tested. I've never seen anything fall outside of the error bars with further investigation. If you see big error bars, there's probably a lot of doubts. Okay, so logistically, I just want to know, I think we're looking for lunch in, what, about 15 minutes, or do you know? Is Jane here, or is she? You're probably baking lunch, yes. Okay, one more quick question.
Back in the late 1950s, Life magazine published a special issue in which they gave all the events of the creation of the Earth. No reference to the Bible at all. It was just a scientific article, but it was no narrative. It just happens that the sequence was the same as in the Bible. And if, just as an engineer, you take the probabilities, 1 times
Yeah.
1 over 6 times 1 over 5 times 1 over 4.
Yep.
It's the sequence of the 6 days.
Well, it's even tougher if you use 11 different miracles that's really describing, yeah, and then the probability even becomes into the billions.
The probability is 1 out of 640 just for the 6 days.
Yeah, just for the 6 days, yeah. No, that's a good point. Matter of fact, the founder, Hugh Ross, he figured out the odds, and I think he used 11 or 14 miracles, somewhere in that range. And it was into the billions when you take all the individual things it describes as God doing. So, yeah, there's a lot there. So, well, let's move on. Jane covered some of this next section, so I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. And this is, now, when we talk about probabilities, we're going to kind of diverge to a little math for a second here. And how many of you are really familiar with factors of 10? Okay, we're going to give you a quick tutorial, okay? 1,000,000 is 10 to the 6th power, okay? So it'd be 1 with 6 zeros after it. 100 is 10 to the 2nd power, 1 with 2 zeros after it. If you wanted to divide 100 into 1,000,000, you would take the 2 and subtract it from the 6, and you would get 10 to the 4th. So 10 to the 6th divided by 10 to the 2nd would be 10 to the 4th, or 10,000. So what I try to do here is just, anyone ever play Yahtzee? All right, I played Yahtzee, I play with my sister all the time. Every so often you roll all 5 dice in the first roll and you get 5 of the same number. Yahtzee! Happens one chance in every 1,296 you do that. Okay? So I figured, well, what's the probability? Let's just say we want to get 50 consecutive Yahtzees. It could be 5 6s, then 5 1s, then 5 2s, but 50 consecutive Yahtzees. This should be a really simple mathematical problem. So let's see if we can simulate that. Okay, so the chance of doing this is 2.34 times 10 to the 156. Okay, real simple. But we're going to give it a lot of help. So we're going to do this 10 to the 18th tries every second. So I try to find what's the most powerful computer we have on the earth. Okay, and I gave us a factor of 10 greater than that, actually a factor of 1,000. We're up to, so our computer is going to be an exa. You know, right now we're getting up to what? Gigabytes, right? Most of us have computers with gigabyte memory. Some have terabytes if you have a real powerful computer. Then you have peta and exa. So this is going to be an exabyte computer. So we're going to do 10 to the 18th tries per second on our new powerful supercomputer. Next slide. And we're going to do this every second since the beginning of time. So 13.73 billion years translates into the 10 to the 18th seconds. And next slide. And we're going to do this, we're going to have 1 trillion people doing this on the supercomputer since the beginning of time. And we're going to have 1 trillion planets with 1 trillion computer users doing this every second since the beginning of time. And we're going to have 1 trillion galaxies with 1 trillion planets with 1 trillion computer users doing this every second since the beginning of time. And just in case you're into a multiverse, we're going to have 1 trillion universes with 1 trillion galaxies with 1 trillion planets with 1 trillion computer users doing this every second since the beginning of time. I think we've devoted enough resources to this. And next slide. All that does is improve your odds to less than 1 chance in 10 to the minus 72. Physicists have a term for things that are that improbable. Impossible. Okay? And this is a really simple mathematical problem. Just 50 Yahtzees in a row. That's it. And you could devote every potential resource, not only in this universe, but in 1 trillion universes, to try to make that happen just once by chance, 50 in a row, and you could never do it. And we're going to look at some probabilities that are far less likely than that. Okay, move on. So these are 6 different areas. I like to break down these areas, and Jane touched on some of these, so I'm going to go through these rather quickly. These are evidence, these things that require a divine solution. The creation of the universe, I break the universe into 3 categories. The creation of the universe, the design and the laws of physics, those 140 things that were talked about, and the design in the Earth, Sun, Moon system. Next slide. And what is the Big Bang? The Big Bang is the beginning of all matter and energy, space, and time. It expands from an infinitely hot condensed state, from a near infinitely hot condensed state, and it cools off as it gets older, and it comes to an end in the distant future. And as you look at the scriptures here, and Mark, you can just go through these slides. These are all things that Scripture teaches very specifically. The beginning of the universe is Genesis 1:1, which we already talked about, and many scriptures talk about God creating the universe. Next. And it also talks about, and this was very interesting back in the 90s when they were coming up with this space energy density term, dark energy, and they called it a stretching force. That's how they described it. It's a stretching force in the laws of physics that is causing the matter in the universe to re-accelerate. So basically, if you look at the universe, think of it as expanding, but it's decelerating because of the force of gravity. So it's like expanding, but slowing down the expansion for the first roughly half of the history of the universe. But then it starts expanding. And that's where this space energy, this stretching force takes over, and now the universe will stretch out and never contract back in itself again. And they described it as a stretching force. And there are several biblical authors that use that exact term. Job 9:8 says, "He alone stretches out the heavens." Psalm 104:2, "He stretches out the heavens like a tent." And it's giving a great word picture of what God is actually doing, what physicists now know today to be true. Next slide, please. And of course, we see a cooling in the universe. We see the laws of physics causing decay. And we see that in the scriptures. The creation itself will be liberated from its bondage